There are moments in life that carve themselves permanently into your memory, not because they were beautiful, but because they were the moment everything changed. The moment the ground opened beneath your feet and what you thought was solid turned out to be nothing but glass. For Clara, that moment came on a Saturday afternoon in October, in the middle of a room full of people who were supposed to love her. She was 8 months pregnant, her back ached, her feet were swollen, and she was standing in the center of a lavishly decorated ballroom, surrounded by crystal centerpieces and imported flower arrangements, holding the gift she had spent 3 months making with her own hands, and her husband was laughing, not a quiet laugh, not a polite, awkward chuckle that he quickly disguised. He was laughing openly, loudly, the kind of laugh a man releases when he has no fear of consequence, when he has grown so comfortable in his cruelty that he no longer bothers to dress it up. He held up the small hand-stitched quilt, the one Clara had worked on every night after dinner, her fingers moving carefully over each square, each color chosen to match the nursery, each stitch sewn with love that she had no other way to express, and he turned it toward the room like it was a punchline. "Look at this," he said, his voice carrying easily over the soft instrumental music and the hum of 80 guests. "My wife made this." He paused, letting the silence hang. "I think she confused our baby shower with a church craft fair." The laughter that followed was the kind that fills a room quickly and dies out awkwardly. Some guests laughed because they didn't know what else to do. Some laughed because they always laughed at whatever Dominic Whitmore said. He was that kind of man, the kind whose wealth made other people nervous and eager to please. Some people didn't laugh at all. Clara's best friend, Rachel, sitting 3 tables away, went completely still. Her eyes found Clara's face, and what she saw there made her press her lips together and look down at her hands. Clara didn't cry. She didn't run from the room. She stood there, one hand resting gently on her rounded belly, her expression perfectly composed, and she smiled the kind of smile that is not really a smile at all. It is the face a woman makes when she has practiced surviving in silence for so long that her features have learned to lie for her. She set the quilt down on the gift table and turned to greet another guest. Because what else do you do? What else can you do when the person who is supposed to protect you is the one holding the knife? But inside, something shifted. Something that had been bending for a long time finally reached its breaking point, and that quiet crack, that almost silent fracture inside Clara's heart, would become the beginning of the most profound transformation anyone in that room could have imagined. Because none of them knew. Not one single person in that glittering ballroom. With the possible exception of Rachel, who knew everything and had been quietly terrified of this moment. For years, none of them knew who Clara really was. Let me tell you about Clara N. Because before she became Clara Whitmore, she was something extraordinary. Clara grew up in a small house in northern Vermont. The kind of house where the wind came through the windows in winter and the heating bill was a constant source of anxiety. Her father was a carpenter who worked long hours and came home smelling of sawdust and wood stain. Her mother was a seamstress who altered wedding dresses and prom gowns on a sewing machine in the corner of the living room. They were not wealthy people, but they were creative, both of them, in the way that people who cannot afford extravagance find richness in what their hands can create. Clara grew up watching her mother transform a bolt of ordinary fabric into something that made a woman cry when she looked in the mirror. She grew up watching her father take a rough piece of wood and coax from it something that looked like it had always been that shape, like it had just been waiting inside the grain. She started drawing at 4. By 7, she was mixing her own colors. By 12, she had filled every notebook, every sketch pad, every spare piece of paper in the house with images that made adults pause and look twice and say quietly to each other when they thought Clara couldn't hear. Where did she come from? She earned a full scholarship to the Rhode Island School of Design. She graduated top of her class. She moved to New York with 2 suitcases and a portfolio so large it barely fit through doorways. And she proceeded to spend 4 years sleeping on a futon in a studio apartment in Brooklyn, eating instant noodles and pouring every single thing she felt and thought and feared and dreamed into her art. She worked in mixed media, paint and fabric, and found objects and ink, layers upon layers of material that somehow resolved themselves into images of devastating emotional clarity. Her first gallery show sold out in 2 hours. The second sold before it opened. By the time she was 28, art collectors in London, Tokyo, and New York were on waiting lists that stretched 18 months just to be considered for a piece of her work. She worked under her maiden name, CN, 3 syllables, in certain rooms, in certain cities. In a world where art was taken seriously and money followed beauty without hesitation, carried the weight of a legend, and yet most people outside that world had never heard of her. That was part of it. Magic. She didn't seek fame. She didn't do interviews or attend celebrity events. She created, and she sold, and she moved through the world with a quietness that felt almost spiritual. Her gallery, run by her best friend Rachel Chun, with meticulous care and ferocious loyalty, handled everything. Clara just painted. Met Dominic Whitmore at a fundraising dinner in Manhattan, a charity event she attended reluctantly at Rachel's insistence. He was seated across from her. He was handsome in a sharp, expensive way, the kind of man who looks like he was assembled by a team of professionals. He had dark eyes that moved quickly, missing nothing, and a smile that was charming in a way Clara recognized immediately as practiced. She had painted enough people to know the difference between a genuine expression and a performed one, but she was also 31 and tired in a way she couldn't quite name, and he was funny that night, surprisingly funny. And he asked her questions about herself with what seemed like genuine interest, and when the dinner ended he waited for her outside and said he'd like to see her again. She did not tell him about her work, not that night. It wasn't a calculated decision, not exactly. It was more that she had spent her entire adult life being someone to whom people attached value based on what she produced. And she was hungry, desperately, quietly hungry, for someone to simply see her. Clara, the woman with ink-stained fingers and a laugh that startled people because it was so much bigger than she looked. She wanted to be loved as herself before she was loved as CN. It seemed reasonable, it seemed romantic, even if it turned out to be the decision that framed everything that followed. They dated for a year. He knew she was creative. He saw her sketches, saw the canvases she kept in a spare bedroom she described as a hobby room, saw the way her eyes moved differently in museums than other people's eyes did. But he didn't ask, and she didn't tell. And in that year she fell in love with him, or with who she believed he was. He was attentive and generous, and he said things that made her feel seen. He told her she was unlike anyone he'd ever met. He said she made him want to be a better version of himself. He proposed on a rainy Tuesday in her kitchen while she was making pasta. No grand gesture, no fanfare, and she said yes before the words were fully out of his mouth. Rachel met with her the next morning and sat across the kitchen table and said, very carefully, "Clara, are you sure about this?" Clara looked at her friend, the woman who had known her since college, who had built her career alongside her, who had held her through every heartbreak and celebrated every triumph, and she said, "I have never been more sure of anything." Rachel said, "Okay," and squeezed her hand. But the look in Rachel's eyes was the look of someone who has run the numbers and does not like the outcome, and is choosing, out of love, to say nothing. The first year of marriage was fine. Difficult in ways she hadn't expected. Dominic traveled constantly, his real estate development firm operating at a pace that left him stretched thin and sometimes impatient, but fine. She kept her studio in Brooklyn, making the drive from their apartment in Manhattan several times a week. She still hadn't told him the full truth about her work. There was always a reason not to. The timing wasn't right, or he seemed stressed, or she was about to tell him and then he said something that made her hesitate, a comment about artists being financially irresponsible, or a joke about people who made decorative things for a living. She filed those comments away without consciously acknowledging them, then she got pregnant. Pregnancy was unplanned but not unwelcome, at least not for Clara. She felt, when she saw those 2 lines on the test, a rush of something so overwhelmingly tender that she sat on the bathroom floor for 20 minutes just breathing. When she told Dominic, he smiled and kissed her forehead and said all the right things. But she noticed, in the days that followed, a subtle shift in him, a distancing, a way of engaging with the pregnancy as a logistical matter rather than an emotional one. He hired an interior decorator for the nursery without asking her. He sent her a list of approved pediatricians. He told her to take it easy in a tone that suggested he found her presence in the studio somewhat less appropriate now. And then there was Celeste. Celeste Beaumont was 33 years old with a finance background, a wardrobe that looked like it was curated by a full-time stylist, and a way of smiling at Dominic in social settings that Clara had noticed from almost the beginning but chosen, because she loved him and wanted to believe in him, to dismiss. Celeste worked in partnership with Dominic on a major commercial development project. She attended every dinner party they hosted. She sent flowers when she heard about the pregnancy, white lilies, 12 of them, in a vase that cost more than most people's monthly groceries, with a card that said, in handwriting that Clara studied for longer than she should have, "So happy for you both." There was something in those 4 words, some quality of performance that made Clara's stomach turn. But she was 8 months pregnant and she told herself she was hormonal and paranoid. She told herself she trusted her husband. She told herself the uneasy feeling in her chest was just the stress of the pregnancy and not something colder and more certain pressing against her ribcage like a stone. The baby shower was Dominic's mother's idea. Victoria Whitmore was a woman of considerable wealth and minimal warmth. The kind of woman who could deliver an insult with a smile so gracious you found yourself thanking her for it. She had never made any secret of the fact that she considered Clara an unusual choice for her son, not unsuitable exactly, but not what she had envisioned. Clara was too quiet, too interior, too given to what Victoria called that artistic temperament, which she pronounced as if it were a mild but inconvenient medical condition. Victoria had wanted someone polished, connected, someone whose family came with a network attached. Victoria planned a shower with the efficiency of a military operation and the aesthetic of someone determined to impress. The venue was the private event room of the most exclusive hotel in the city. She invited every significant person in their social circle, plus several who were there purely for appearances. Clara had input on precisely nothing. When she mentioned, once, that she would have preferred something smaller and more intimate, Victoria looked at her with an expression of patient incomprehension and said, "Darling, this is how things are done in this family." Clara spent those final months of pregnancy doing two things that seemed entirely separate but were, in ways she did not yet understand, deeply connected. She worked, and she made things with her hands. The working, the real work, the painting she did at night, when Dominic was traveling or asleep. In a room she had converted in the house they had moved to in Connecticut, a room he had never once opened the door of, a room she kept locked, not out of secrecy but because it was the one space in her daily life that was entirely her own. She painted large, furious, emotional canvases that poured from her like rain after a drought. She painted her pregnancy. She painted her uncertainty. She painted what it felt like to love someone and not be sure they saw you. Rachel came twice to collect what she called the most profound work Clara had ever made, and both times she stood in the room for a long time without speaking. And when she finally did speak, her voice was unsteady. And then there was the other thing, the handmade gifts. She crocheted a blanket in the colors of Avema, autumn, rust and gold and deep green because those were the colors of her childhood. She stitched a quilt from fabric scraps that each meant something, a piece of her mother's old work apron, a square cut from the dress she'd worn to her first gallery show, a patch of the blue flannel from one of her father's old shirts, painted tiny watercolor illustrations, 12 of them, one for each month of a year, to frame in the nursery. She built, using her father's old woodworking tools that she'd kept all these years, a small wooden mobile of hand-carved animals, each one painted in intricate detail, a bear, a fox, a heron, a deer. These things took months. They cost almost nothing in materials. They were worth, in terms of love and intention and time, more than anything else in that shower room. And her husband held the quilt up in front of 80 people and compared it to a church craft fair. What happened after the laughter died down? At that show it was not dramatic. Life rarely produces its most significant moments with fanfare. The rest of the afternoon unfolded in the polished, superficial way of events among wealthy people who have learned to keep their real feelings behind glass. Guests cooed over designer bassinet sets and monogrammed cashmere blankets. Victoria presided with obvious satisfaction. Celeste arrived late, 45 minutes in, wearing a cream silk blouse and carrying a gift in a bag from a boutique so exclusive it didn't have signage, and when she handed it to Dominic, not to Clara, the way their fingers touched on the handle was a second too slow and a fraction too deliberate. And Clara, who was trained by years of artistic work to see exactly what was in front of her, saw it completely. She ate a small plate of fruit, she thanked people graciously, she held her back straight and her chin level. And when the last guest had gone and she was standing in the otherwise empty elevator of the hotel with Dominic and Victoria and a bellboy loading gifts onto a cart, she listened to Dominic tell his mother, "We'll donate the craft store stuff to charity," and she pressed her hand flat against her stomach, feeling her daughter move, and she made herself a quiet and absolute promise. The next morning, Clara called Rachel. "I want everything in order," she said. "The Whitmore paintings, the trust, all of it. I want to know exactly where I stand." Rachel was quiet for a moment. "Clara, what happened?" Everything I was afraid of, Clara said. And some things I should have been afraid of sooner, Rachel said. I'll call the lawyers today. In the weeks that followed, Clara watched Dominic more carefully and pretended to watch him less. She noticed the phone he answered in another room, his voice low and warm in a register she hadn't heard him use with her in months. She noticed the gym bag he brought home still dry on Tuesday evenings when he claimed to have worked out. She noticed the way Celeste's name appeared on his lips too casually, too readily, the way people perform indifference toward the things they're most attached to. She put these pieces together with a precise, unflinching perception of someone who had spent 20 years training herself to see the truth of a thing, regardless of whether that truth was comfortable. She also began preparing for what was coming. She met with Rachel in person at the gallery, slipping in through the back entrance, something she always did when she wanted to keep her visits quiet. They sat in Rachel's office surrounded by the catalogs and correspondence that documented a career of breathtaking scope. And Rachel laid out the full picture with the thoroughness of someone who had been quietly dreading this conversation, but was immensely relieved to be having it. The CN portfolio, as of that fiscal year, was valued conservatively at $42 million. There were 12 major collectors across 4 continents who had standing first refusal arrangements on any new work. 3 museum retrospectives were in various stages of planning. A documentary filmmaker from London had been requesting access for 2 years. The work that Clara had produced during her pregnancy, the 6 large canvases that Rachel had collected from that locked room, had already generated quiet, frenzied interest from 2 of the world's most significant art institutions, neither of which knew the story behind the paintings yet, but both of whom recognized in them something that stopped people cold. You have built something extraordinary, Rachel said, and none of it, not one brushstroke of it, belongs to him. Clara looked at her friend and felt, for the first time in months, something that resembled strength. Dominic came home the following Thursday and told her, in the kitchen, while she was making dinner, that he had spoken to a lawyer. Not their lawyer, his lawyer. He framed it carefully, in the vocabulary of someone who was being coached. He said he was exploring options, that he wanted them both to have clarity, that he felt they had grown in different directions, and he wanted to be honest with them. He said all of this without looking directly at her. He said it to the refrigerator, to the countertop, to the middle distance. Clara turned off the stove. She turned to face him. She was 36 weeks pregnant. Her ankles were swollen and her lower back had been aching since morning, and there was a child inside her whose future she was now entirely responsible for protecting. And she looked at this man she had loved, this man she had chosen, this man who had laughed at the things she made with her hands, and she felt, beneath the grief, something clean and sharp and clarifying. I know about Celeste, she said. The silence that fell was complete. He started to speak. She raised one hand, the gesture quiet but absolute, and he stopped. I don't want to do this tonight, she said. I'm tired, I'm pregnant, and I need you to leave me alone until I tell you differently. He left the kitchen. She stood there for a moment, her hand on the countertop, breathing slowly. Then she served herself dinner, sat at the table alone, and ate every bite, because she was growing a person, and that person needed to be fed. 3 days later, Clara went into early labor. It was not entirely unexpected. Her doctor, Dr. Sarah Nolan, had been monitoring her closely and had mentioned more than once that the stress indicators in Clara's blood work were elevated, and that while the baby was developing beautifully, Clara's own body was showing signs of prolonged strain. She was 2 weeks ahead of schedule. The contractions started at 4 in the morning, persistent and deepening, and she called Rachel before she called Dominic. Not because she didn't want Dominic there, but because she needed, first, the voice of someone who loved her without condition. Dominic drove her to the hospital. He sat in the waiting room for much of it, because that is the kind of presence he offered, proximate but not near, available but not there. Rachel arrived within the hour and took Clara's hand and held it. And Dr. Nolan moved through the room with the calm efficiency of someone who had navigated 1,000 storms and knew exactly how to keep her footing in all of them. Clara's daughter arrived at 11:47 in the morning. She was small but strong, with a mouth that opened immediately into a cry so furious and clear that the delivery nurse laughed in surprise. She had Clara's eyes wide and dark and already looking at the world with an expression of intense concentration, as if cataloging everything. Clara held her for the first time and felt all the complicated, terrible things of the past months recede, not disappear but recede, like a tide pulling back to reveal the bedrock underneath, and the Bedrock was this child. This small, furious, perfect child. She named her Iris. Clara had always loved the word "the flower." Yes, but also the part of the eye, the colored ring that determines how you see the light. Dominic appeared in the room an hour after Iris was born. He held her briefly and said she was beautiful, which she was. He looked, in that hour, like the man Clara had once believed he was entirely, and she hated him gently for that, for the cruelty of still being capable of appearing to be something he wasn't. What happened next? He could not have anticipated. He had no reason to anticipate it. From his perspective, he was married to a woman with a craft hobby and no independent income. A woman who depended on the allowance he provided. A woman whose departure from the marriage would cost him whatever a reasonable divorce settlement required, and very little beyond that. He had already had conversations with his lawyer about asset protection. He had already begun structuring certain investments in ways that would be difficult for a divorce. Proceeding to assess clearly, he felt, in the quiet confidence of a man who has always had more than those around him, that he had this situation in hand. He did not know that while Clara was in labor, a gallery in Midtown Manhattan was hosting the opening night of what had been quietly marketed to the art world's inner circle as the most significant exhibition of the decade. The show was called Carrion. It comprised 6 large-scale mixed-media works created by CN, or produced in the past 8 months. Each one a portrait of pregnancy rendered in materials, fabric, paint, ink, found objects that hit with the emotional force of something you hadn't known you needed to feel until it knocked the air from your chest. The gallery director had called the work the most important thing she's made. An international art publication had scheduled a major feature that was now being expedited to coincide with the show. The opening was attended by collectors, curators, critics, journalists, and no fewer than 3 museum directors from 2 continents. 3 works had already sold before the doors opened. The purchase prices not disclosed but whispered about in a range that made people lean in and verify what they'd heard. And among the opening night crowd, entirely by coincidence, was a journalist named Blake Mercer, who wrote a culture column for a major national newspaper and was there at the invitation of a collector friend. Blake had heard of C and knew the name with the hazy reverence most people reserve for artists whose work they admired but didn't entirely understand. He stood in front of the largest painting for a long time. It was called The Silent Wife. It was 6 feet by 8 feet. A woman shone from behind, standing at a window. Her silhouette unmistakably pregnant, the textures of the canvas so complex and layered that the more closely you looked, the more you saw fabric within fabric, words within paint. The architecture of a whole interior life, rendered in material you had to almost press your nose against the surface to read. It was devastating in the way that true things are devastating, not because they show you something you've never seen, but because they show you something you've always known but never had the language for. Blake took a photograph of the piece on his phone and sent it to his editor with the message, "This artist. We need to talk." Then he spoke to a gallery assistant and asked, as journalists always do, whether there was any personal story behind the exhibition. The gallery assistant was trained to be discreet, but she was also young and excited, and the evening was electric. And she said, "The artist is actually in the hospital right now. She just had her baby." Blake paused. "What's her name?" "The artist goes by CN," the assistant said. "Her married name is Whitmore." Blake typed the name into his phone. His search results came back in seconds. Dominic Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore, a development group. His wife listed in multiple society page mentions as Clara Whitmore, NIEN. A few photographs. Clara at charity dinners. Clara at the periphery of the kinds of events that her husband attended and she appeared to endure. In every photo, she looked as though she was politely elsewhere. Blake called his editor. The article ran online 14 hours later. It was titled, "Who is CN?" The world's most private artist just had a baby, and her husband, apparently, had no idea who he married. Blake had been careful. He had called Rachel, who answered because she recognized the newspaper's number and made a split-second decision. Rachel confirmed the basic facts and declined specific comment. She said Clara was resting and unavailable. She said the work spoke for itself, but she did not deny anything. And her non-denial was in its own way a confirmation. The article was shared 40,000 times in the first 6 hours. Clara learned about it from Dr. Nolan, of all people, who came into her hospital room the following morning looking slightly dazed and held up her phone and said, "I'm sorry, I have to ask, is this you?" Clara looked at the screen. She looked at the headline. She looked at the photograph of the silent wife. She was sitting up in bed with Iris asleep against her chest. And she was 24 hours postpartum and operating on almost no sleep. And she read the article once, carefully, all the way through. And she handed the phone back to Dr. Nolan and said, "Yes, that's me." Dr. Nolan stared at her for a moment. Then she said, "Would you like some more tea, please?" Clara said. Dominic found out differently. He was in the hotel lobby, their hotel room, paid for to be near the hospital when his phone began to ring in a frequency and pattern that meant something was wrong. It started with his business partner, then a board member, then a client he had been courting for 6 months, then his mother, then Horgley, Celeste. Each call carried a version of the same information, arriving like successive waves that grew instead of diminishing. Until he was standing in the lobby of the hotel staring at a photograph on his phone of a painting called The Silent Wife, and reading an article that described his wife as one of the most significant and financially successful artists of her generation, and it was as if the floor of his understanding had simply disappeared. He went back to the hospital. He walked into Clara's room and stopped in the doorway. Clara was feeding Iris. She looked up at him with an expression so composed, so utterly without surprise, that he understood in an instant something that devastated him. She had known this moment was coming. She had been ready for it. She had been ready for it for a long time. He was the only one who had been blind, Clara, he said. She waited. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question came out smaller than he intended. She looked at him for a long moment. In that look was the entire history of what she had tried to give him and what he had failed to recognize. The story of a woman who had offered herself, her real self, not the famous self, not the wealthy self, but just herself, and had not been seen. "I wanted you to love me before you loved what I was worth," she said quietly. "I wanted to know if you could do that." She looked down at Iris. "You answered that question." The silence stretched. He opened his mouth and closed it again. He looked like a man trying to locate solid ground in a room where every surface was moving. "The quilt," he said. His voice had changed register entirely. "The one eye, yes," Clara said. "I made that." Clara, dominant. She looked at him once more, and her expression was not angry. It was something more difficult to receive than anger. It was sad, in the way that closed doors are sad. Not dramatic, but final. "I need to rest. Please let me rest." He left, and for the first time in almost 2 years, Clara felt the particular relief of a burden that has been carried so long. You have stopped noticing its weight until the moment it is finally set down. The next several days were a hurricane, but Clara was at its eye still, clear-eyed, and undisturbed. Rachel arrived with flowers and a lawyer named Daniel Park who had been on retainer for the CN estate for 4 years. He was precise and calm and enormously thorough, and he laid out the complete landscape of Clara's financial position, with the clarity of someone who takes genuine pleasure in delivering good news to someone who deserves it. The art portfolio alone, separate from any marital assets, predating the marriage entirely, fully documented through the gallery and protected by a comprehensive trust structure, Rachel had insisted on establishing 2 years before Clara ever met Dominic, was currently valued at $42.3 million. The 6 paintings in the carrying exhibition had all sold. The largest, The Silent Wife, had sold to a private collector for $2.1 million, the highest price ACN work had ever commanded. There were inquiries from museums. There were requests for comment from every major publication covering art. There was an email from the London documentary filmmaker that Rachel had described as almost tearfully excited. Daniel explained that because Clara had maintained all her artistic assets entirely separate from the marital estate, because she had signed no prenuptial agreement and Dominic had no claim on work created before or independently of the marriage, her financial standing in any divorce proceeding was exactly what it had always been, entirely her own and entirely intact. Moreover, she had a solid and well-documented claim on several marital assets, including the Connecticut property, which had been purchased in part with funds that, upon careful examination, included proceeds from the early days of their marriage, when Clara had quietly contributed from her own holdings to a degree that had never been formally acknowledged. "He doesn't have leverage here," Daniel said simply. "He never did." Clara sat with all of this. Then she said, "What I want is straightforward. I want out cleanly. I want Iris protected. I don't want a war." She paused. "But I want him to understand exactly what he had and what he chose to throw away." Daniel nodded. "I can arrange that," he said. Meanwhile, the world outside the hospital, room was moving at a pace and in a direction that no one, least of all Dominic, had anticipated. The story was everywhere. The human interest dimension of it was irresistible. The kind of narrative that spreads not because people are cruel, but because it taps something deep and universal. The woman who was dismissed, the wife who was laughed at, the artist who turned out to be the most powerful person in the room. Social media had gotten hold of a guest's video from the baby shower. Someone had filmed part of it on their phone, as people always do, and in that video, very clearly, was Dominic holding up the hand-stitched quilt and making the craft. Fair joke. The video had been viewed millions of times. The comments were uniformly devastating. People who had never heard of seeing the artist now knew her name, knew her face, knew the story of a woman who had spent months making something with her hands that was dismissed in 30 seconds by a man who didn't know, who hadn't bothered to know who she was. Art critics were writing about what it meant that the most emotionally powerful work of her career had been created during the months of her greatest personal pain. The carrying exhibition extended its run by 2 months due to demand. A museum in Chicago announced it was acquiring one of the smaller pieces for its permanent collection. Rachel was fielding calls from every continent. She handled all of it with the serene efficiency of someone watching a plan unfold exactly as expected. Dominic's world moved in the opposite direction. The viral video had reached people he needed to maintain professional relationships with. 3 of his major investor clients sent emails over 2 days, all phrased diplomatically, all containing variations of the same message. They were re-evaluating their partnerships. One client, a woman named Dr. Patricia Sung, who was one of the most influential development financiers on the East Coast, called him personally. She had been a quiet admirer of CN for years. She told Dominic, politely but without ambiguity, that she found his behavior toward his wife publicly documented and professionally concerning, and that she would be redirecting her capital to other projects. The Whitmore Development Group's stock, which was not publicly traded but whose value was deeply intertwined with these private relationships, began to shift in ways that his CFO characterized as troubling. Celeste called him twice. He did not answer the second time. What he had said to a colleague in a moment of vulnerability, that Celeste was the kind of person who loves a winner, was true in a way that now felt like prophecy. She had not signed on to be associated with a man who was viral on social media for mocking his pregnant wife's handmade gifts. She had very little patience for the kind of attention that made people look twice and nodded. She sent him a text 2 weeks later that said, "I think we both know this isn't going to work." And he stared at that text for a long time and felt the specific loneliness of someone who has burned down everything worth having in pursuit of something that turned out to be empty. His mother called from her apartment in the city with a voice that Clara would have recognized, and perhaps found some grim satisfaction in it. Was the voice of a woman recalibrating, the voice of someone who has spent years building a particular architecture of judgment and is now observing a collapse. "I had no idea," Victoria said. "I had absolutely no idea who she was." And Dominic, sitting alone in the Connecticut house whose every room now felt like an accusation, said, "Neither did I." And the grief in his own voice surprised him. He had never hated himself for not knowing. He hated himself now for how he had treated what he didn't know. Because the not knowing wasn't the crime, the not caring was. He had looked at his wife, this woman who moved through the world with quiet depth and precise perception, and a creative intelligence that could be described, if you were being accurate, as genius, and he had decided she was small. He had decided she was decorative and slightly inconvenient, a chapter of his life that he had written without reading carefully. He had laughed at what her hands made, in public, in front of everyone, while she was carrying his daughter, and he had not seen the devastation in her face, because he hadn't been looking. He asked to see. Clara Rachel managed the communication, and she did it with the controlled courtesy of someone who has very strong feelings and has decided, for the sake of her person, to express none of them. She conveyed the request. Clara considered it for 2 days, and then she agreed, once, briefly, in a place of her choosing. They met in the lobby of the hospital, Clara with Iris in a carrier against her chest. Because she had learned already in 9 days of motherhood that the close, warm weight of her daughter made everything she needed to do feel more possible. She was not wearing something designed to make a statement. She was wearing a loose linen shirt and practical shoes, and her hair was pulled back. And she looked, in the way that people who have stopped performing for an audience always look, entirely and unmistakably herself. Dominic sat across from her and he looked different than she had ever seen him. The expensive quality of him was still there. The surface was intact. But the confidence that had always animated it was gone, and without it he looked simply like a man, neither more nor less than that, and somewhat diminished by the reduction. He started with "I'm sorry." He said it several times. He said it in the way of someone who means it but doesn't yet understand it, who is sorry for the outcome but still sorting through their culpability for the cause. He said he hadn't known. He said if he had known, Clara stopped him there. Gently, but completely. "That's the problem, Dominic," she said. "That's the whole problem, right there. You didn't know because you didn't try to know. You didn't ask. You didn't look. You decided what I was and you stopped looking. And the things I made." She paused. And for just a moment something moved across her face that was not quite composed. Something that was the echo of a woman standing in a hotel ballroom with 80 people laughing. "The things I made with my hands, for our daughter, out of love. You held those up like they were a joke, in front of everyone." She looked at him clearly. "Not because you didn't know I was worth $40 million, but because you didn't think they were worth your respect. And that is not a mistake you make when you're uninformed. That is the kind of mistake you make when you've decided someone doesn't matter." He said nothing. He could not argue with that, because it was true, and somewhere in his chest, in the part of a person that exists below pride and strategy and self-protection, he knew it had always been true. Clara reached into the bag beside her. She removed something folded in tissue paper, small enough to carry in one hand. She set it on the table between them. He looked at it. It was a small square of stitched fabric, one of the panels from the quilt he had held up at the shower. She had cut it free before donating the rest. This square showed a small painted detail she had added to the center of each panel. A heron in flight, rendered in blue thread so fine it looked almost printed, the wings raised and the neck extended, in the particular posture of a bird committing fully to the act of moving forward. She had done this for hours. She had done it at night, by lamplight, while he slept or traveled or conducted whatever life he was conducting outside her knowledge. She had pressed each stitch into the fabric with her mother's needle and her father's patience and a love for the child not yet born. That was the most genuine thing in her daily existence. And she had made it beautiful, not because she was trying to prove something, but because she was incapable of making things any other way. "Keep that," she said. She looked at him once more, and her voice was quiet and final. "One day, when Iris is old enough to ask why her parents aren't together, you can show it to her, and you can tell her what you said about it." She stood. She adjusted the carrier against her chest. Iris stirred briefly and made a small sound, something between a sigh and a murmur. And Clara pressed one hand lightly to her daughter's back and looked, for just a moment, so wholly complete, so entirely herself and sufficient and unbowed, that Dominic felt the loss of her land fully, the way loss always lands. Like something you didn't understand you were carrying until you set it down. Clara walked out through the glass lobby doors into a morning that was cold and bright. The kind of October morning where the light is thin and long-angled and makes everything sharp. She did not look back. She moved, within 3 weeks of leaving the hospital, into a space that Rachel had found for her, a converted 19th century mill in upstate New York, all exposed brick and high ceilings and north-facing windows that flooded the upper rooms with a particular quality of light that painters describe as the best kind. The kind that shows everything true. It was enormous and slightly impractical and perfect. She had a studio on the top floor that opened onto a terrace where you could see the hills, and she set up Iris's room next to it, so that when she was working she could hear her daughter, and when Iris woke she could cross the hall and stand at the window with her, and show her the hills. Rachel visited the first weekend and brought wine. She opened, but they mostly didn't drink and stayed up until 2 in the morning talking the way they had in college, freely and without agenda, and at some point in the conversation Rachel started to cry, quietly, and when Clara asked why, Rachel said, "Because I watched you be smaller than yourself for 2 years, and now you're just you again." Clara didn't say anything. She leaned over and pressed her cheek against Rachel's, and they sat there in the kitchen of the mill house with the baby monitor on the table, and the hills outside the window dark and still. The divorce was finalized 5 months later. It was, as Clara had requested, clean. Dominic's lawyer had explored every avenue of leverage and found none. The settlement acknowledged the Connecticut property's partial funding by Clara's assets and awarded it to her. Though she chose to sell it, she never wanted to return there. Iris's custody arrangement was carefully structured to ensure that Dominic remained present in his daughter's life. Because despite everything, Clara believed a child deserved a parents if those parents could manage it, and Dominic, whatever his failures as a husband, was trying in the careful, effortful way of someone learning to try to be better than he had been. The carrying exhibition traveled to London and then to Tokyo, and then to a retrospective space in Chicago that drew the largest attendance of any CN show in history. The Silent Wife was written about in a 15,000-word essay in a prestigious art journal that described it as a monument to the art of enduring visibility, the record of a woman who never stopped seeing, even when she was not being seen. The documentary filmmaker from London finally got her access, and she and Clara spent 6 months on a film that would premiere at an international festival to a standing ovation. The painting remained on long-term loan to a public collection in New York, where it hung in a gallery that was free to enter, so that anyone could stand in front of it. Clara painted. She raised Iris. She called her mother every Sunday as she took Iris to Vermont in August to visit her parents' house and showed her the woods and the fields, and sat with her on the porch in the long summer evening and told her things about her grandmother's needle and her grandfather's wood, about hands that make things and what it means to build something from nothing, but patience and love and the particular quality of attention that is really just another word for caring. Iris, at 6 months, had not yet acquired language, but she looked at her mother's face while Clara talked, and she looked at it with those wide, dark eyes, deeply and without looking away, and Clara felt, in those moments, that everything that had happened, all the grief and the humiliation and the long silence of being misunderstood, had been the price of arriving here at this porch, with this child, in this life that was entirely and unapologetically hers. Dominic saw the documentary when it aired. He watched it alone, in a rented apartment in the city. The Connecticut house sold, the Whitmore Development Group restructured and smaller than it had been. He watched Clara move through the film with a kind of grace that he recognized only now as the particular grace of a person who has nothing left to prove. He watched a moment near the end where the filmmaker asked Clara what she would say to someone who had dismissed something she'd made, and Clara was quiet for a moment, her eyes going somewhere slightly internal, and then she smiled. Not the performed smile, the real one, the one he had almost never seen, and she said, "I'd say thank you, because every time someone looked through me, I painted something better." He turned off the screen. He sat for a long time in the dark and quiet of the apartment. On the table beside him was a small square of fabric she had given him, the heron with its wings raised, the thread so fine it looked like light. He had not put it away. He was not sure he ever would, because some lessons are the kind you spend the rest of your life learning, and some gifts you understand only when it's too late to thank the person who made them. Clara woke the next morning before Iris did. She made tea in the kitchen of the mill house, standing at the window while the kettle boiled, watching the hills come into visibility as the light thickened. The studio waited upstairs, a large canvas primed and ready, the start of something she could not yet see fully, but could feel the shape of the way you feel a word on the edge of your tongue. She had learned long ago not to push that feeling, not to force the image forward, but to stand in the morning and let the light do its work and wait for the moment when her hands knew what her mind was still learning. Iris woke at 6:45, as she usually did, with that same clear, certain cry that she had arrived in the world with, the sound of a person who has decided to be present and wants the world to know it. Clara set down her tea and went to her, lifting her from the small wooden crib that Clara's father had driven 6 hours to deliver and set up himself, his hands patient and precise on the joints. The wood smelling of the shop in Vermont, of sawdust and varnish, and every morning she had ever watched him make something from almost nothing. She lifted Iris and held her against her chest and stood at the window of the nursery and showed her the hills. "Good morning," Clara said. Iris looked at the window. She looked at the hills. Then she looked at her mother's face, with that wide, dark-eyed regard, that quality of attention that was already the thing Clara loved most in the world. Outside, the light was coming, thin and long-angled the way October light always is, the kind that shows everything true, the kind that leaves nothing hidden. And in the studio at the top of the stairs, the canvas waited, and the brushes waited, and the paint waited, and Clara N., who had never stopped being exactly who she was, not for a marriage, not for a ballroom of laughter, not for a man who confused the price of things with their value, was ready to begin.